Daniel Wright is the Senior Vice President for Stonebridge International, which advises clients on China-related strategies and planning. Now, I've known Dan for almost 20 years now. We were classmates at Johns Hopkins SAIS in the early 1990s. We lived in the same building in Arlington. Our oldest children are very close in age and attended each other's birthday parties and swam in the same pool together. And we've been close friends ever since. Occasionally, our travels take us to different parts of the world, and we're often not together. But whenever I get back to Washington, my other hometown, or Dan gets to Beijing or someplace, we find a chance to meet. And I'm so delighted that he's been able to come to Indiana, both today and tomorrow. Dan, after leaving SAIS, went on to become the executive director of the Hopkins Nanjing Center, which is the premier educational joint venture in China. I was a student there before he took over, and the center really developed in the years it was under his leadership. He was also the vice president for the National Bureau of Asian Research in Washington, D.C., and before those, a fellow with the Institute of Current World Affairs. And I would challenge anyone to find someone else who's lived in Guizhou for 2 years recently and then published an amazing book about his experiences there, which doesn't just speak to Guizhou, but to all of the changes that China has been undergoing. Most recently, he was the managing director of the U.S.-China Strategic Economic Dialogue, working closely with Secretary Paulson. And the dialogue made a number of major initiatives which he's directly involved in and responsible for. Since earlier this spring, he joined Stonebridge, and they're extremely lucky to have him. There's no one else who has the range of experiences, knowledge, and sensitivity to China that I've ever met in the United States. And people have talked about cultural awareness and knowledge. He lives it and walks it and breathes it every single day. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you Dan Wright.
Let's just go to the reception. That was pretty good. I enjoyed it. That was great. Thanks, Scott. I do want to congratulate Dr. Kennedy and the university for this amazing conference. It's very refreshing to be here. I live in Washington, D.C., and for the last couple of years have really worked at the central federal government level between the two countries, and to come to a conference like this where we have people from both countries doing real things that are adding value, whether in the areas of scholarship or commerce or relationships or politics, it's deeply encouraging because it's so important to the fundamental interest of both of our countries. So I, again, congratulate Dr. Kennedy and his center for hosting this. It's making a big impact, and understanding the interactions of commerce and politics is very, very important. I also want to take a moment to thank the sponsors. I know there are a number of financial sponsors, and it's very easy to overlook them, but these things don't just happen. Some of you made a commitment to underwrite this, and that's very important. I want to personally thank you for that. This year, as has been referenced earlier today, we're celebrating the 30th year of normalized relations between the United States and China. And as we all know, the strategic imperative of the 1970s in our relationship was a common fear, a fear of the Soviet Union. That's really what took President Nixon to China and kind of launched what then became our normalized relationship. 30 years later, there's a very different strategic rationale in the U.S.-China relationship, but even more compelling for our relationship, and that's economic growth and stability. And these various panels are really making that specific. But if you kind of broaden that out to the national level, the underlying strategic imperative in the U.S.-China relationship now is economic growth and stability. That's why it's very encouraging to see what President Bush and Secretary Paulson and President Hu and Vice Premier Wang Qishan began through the Strategic Economic Dialogue, continue now with President Obama, President Hu, and now we have Secretary Clinton, Secretary Geithner, State Councilor Dai, and Vice Premier Wang Qishan. So some more actors, but in the announcement 2 weeks ago in London at the G20 of the strategic and economic dialogue, that continuity in a high-level mechanism between our two countries is very, very important and is consistent with the strategic imperative. I want to read just a sentence from the White House press release from 2 weeks ago, stating the intention of the SNED. It's to work together to build a positive, cooperative, and comprehensive U.S.-China relationship for the 21st century, and to maintain and strengthen exchanges at all levels. That's very encouraging for both of our countries, and it'll be very exciting to see this continue. As you know, the first meeting of the strategic and economic, this SNED, will be in July in Washington. So I think we'll begin to see in the press, we'll begin to see a lot of energy around that coming together here very, very shortly, actually, in just a couple months. So it's great to be with you all today. I'd like to do a couple things, really just two things in the time I have, and I'm aware of the time in terms of Dr. Cao said this, what time it is for him, and really for many of you. So I'll be patient if I see nodding heads. But there are two things I'd like to do. One is just in the spirit of kind of reflection, share, I guess it's 4 observations that we learned from the U.S. side in the Strategic Economic Dialogue. And again, with understanding that my perspective the last couple years has really come out of our federal government and working at the Treasury Department. But some observations are kind of key lessons we learned to share with you. And then the second thing is to share some observations on prospects going forward. Fairly simple, but I'll look forward to being with you all this evening and then also tomorrow in Bloomington. And we'll look forward to chatting more as we have opportunity. But in the area of some key observations, or in some regard, the premises, the qianti of how we established the Strategic Economic Dialogue, the first observation was, again, it's a self-evident truth to those in this room, but the U.S.-China economic relationship is indeed the most important economic relationship of the 21st century. I mean, that's why this conference is entitled as it is. You just have to look at the key data. You just have to look at the facts, both on the opportunity side in terms of where all the economic growth has come from, the U.S. and China being the economic engines of the world, certainly for the last 10 years, and some great data we've heard throughout the day, especially from Michael at lunch from AmCham. But also on the challenging side, the U.S. and China are the largest contributors of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. So we have a lot of fundamental kind of broad economic issues we also must address together. But both for our individual national interests and for global interests, the U.S. and China, we must get the economic relationship right. It has tremendous implications for our local communities and for us nationally and for the globe. It's a self-evident fact, but it is exactly why the Strategic Economic Dialogue was formed. Second observation is when the story is that Secretary Paulson was approached a number of times by the president to come down to Washington and be the Secretary of Treasury. As you know, he was the chairman of Goldman Sachs. Prior to that, he had been to China about 70 times in 10 years, so he was a frequent visitor to China while in the private sector. But he turned down the opportunity a number of times. But in the process of refusing to come to Washington, he started to think, are there a couple things that he could do that would be particularly added value to the United States and to the world? And over time, in the process of refusing, he started to think more about the U.S.-China economic relationship, its importance, as I've just mentioned. And what he observed and then eventually shared with the president was the concept of a strategic economic dialogue, which would be an innovation in the way our two governments at the central government level work together, a new style of working together that was commensurate with the demands and the opportunities that were present. So his requirement to the president was that he would be the first among equals in the former cabinet on the China relationship, and the president agreed to that, and he came to Washington, and the SED was born. But this observation of the need for an innovation in the relationship, to step up the relationship, to work what we call the strategic overlap of our interests. A Venn diagram, the two circles and how they overlap. The SED was focused on where our interests are overlapping. Now, certainly we have areas of conflict, and there are institutions both within our governments and international and multilaterally that address areas of conflict like the WTO. But there was a need for an innovation to really, really go after and advance the strategic overlap of our interests. There was also a need for an innovation to work our economic relationship at a much higher level politically and a broader level. There are about 60 bilateral back and forth sister initiatives at the central and federal government level on China. There's an energy dialogue. You name it. There's something going on in a one-to-one, agency to agency, but there was not a comprehensive overarching umbrella. So the SED was an innovation in the U.S.-China economic relationship. The third lesson or premise of the strategic economic dialogue is really an echo of what we've heard throughout the day today in your own personal experiences, and that's the importance of relationships. All too often, particularly in the government sector, everything is very formal. You go in, you exchange, you sit especially in China, the big, comfortable, stuffy chairs with the tea, and you exchange talking points. You walk out, you high-five your colleagues, and nothing happens. What we did through the strategic economic dialogue, in the design of the dialogue, is we structured in a lot of opportunities privately for the leaders of our two countries to get to know each other, to spend informal time together. So that in addition to the formal meetings, which are important, there was also informal opportunities to have interaction. I'll tell you one little story that'll give you a flavor for this. And again, as we all know in our own places of work, as personal relationships develop, we've heard about trust, we've heard about common understanding, but it really does affect the bottom line on whatever agenda you have on either side of the table. But one little very interesting story about kind of a little bit of texture on this. I can't remember which round of the SCD it was. I think it was the second or third round, and we were going to meet in Beijing, and Vice Premier Wang Qishan's key staff emailed us and said, let's have a ping pong match when we have the SCD. We're going to meet at a conference center outside Beijing, and this is all off the record, no press, so we didn't really take it seriously because we knew this was a setup and we would lose and there was nothing we could do about it. So we didn't really take it very seriously. And about 2 weeks before we're actually going over for the meeting, our counterpart emailed back and said, no, let's really do this. Again, the idea of structuring some less formal time. So after one of the dinners at this conference center, we would have a ping pong match, and all the, like 9 U.S. cabinet secretaries, all of China's economic leadership team, we would kind of circle around a ping pong table, and the Chinese would put up their best, and the U.S. would put up their best, kind of like David and Goliath, I guess, push the guy out. And there's Goliath. And obviously the Chinese already knew who they were going to put up, but we had no clue. So we had our delegation. It was a pretty large delegation, and we sent around a note saying, does anyone in this group play ping pong? Our Chinese friends really want to play ping pong. Is anyone? Well, it turns out our technology guy, we always have what we call a control room, which is in the hotel where we have computers for the U.S. side to work on it. And the staff on the U.S. side in charge of our control room, as it turns out, had just retired and was a nationally ranked ping pong player in the United States. And he does not look like a ping pong player. He looks like kind of a technology nerd, but the guy could really play. And so Ronnie grabbed his bag and his equipment, and anyway, you can imagine the economic leadership from both countries there around a ping pong player, and this IT guy from the U.S., how should we say, soundly defeated Vice Premier Wang Qishan's lead staff, who was evidently a very proud but not good enough ping pong player. In fact, the Financial Times later heard about this and wrote up this really interesting little piece about ping pong diplomacy. The Chinese never asked us to play sports again with them after that. But can you imagine around the table just all the laughter and informality and cheering and friendship and exchange, relationships, particularly among government officials in that way, are very, very important. The final kind of key observation or lesson, and Dr. Cao mentioned, he talked about a double structure, which I often think of as kind of a two-level game, kind of in a different way, but Dr. Cao's concept triggered this, and that is what you see in the U.S.-China relationship, not just in the economic area, but broadly, when there's a positive, stable, productive relationship at the central and federal government levels, it creates a space underneath, it creates an atmosphere where all types of collaboration really thrives. Whether it's commercial activity, whether you're a small business owner or a large investor, whether you're an academic, regardless. And what we were really focused on through the strategic economic dialogue is to maintain the relationship on an even keel, to create space so that both within the economic cooperation, but also political cooperation, academic, the entire kind of U.S.-China relationship would have an atmosphere that would be very productive and positive. Now, I know a lot of us here have also lived in China, or you've lived in the United States when we've had rough patches. And when you're on the ground in the other country, and whether it's Belgrade or the EP3, or we all have memories, and you know how things tighten up, and it's hard to get things done. But one of the key lessons where we really focused on in the SCD was to create that kind of overarching atmosphere that would create a space for initiatives from both countries to really thrive. So we did accomplish a fair amount through the strategic economic dialogue, and it was very exciting, and I think we'll have a very good a fruit that will continue to bear both commercially and for the relationship of our people. Looking forward, kind of the second big bucket of remarks I wanted to make was prospects looking forward. As I continue to work in Washington, D.C. and have a lot of colleagues who are senior career staff at the State Department, now working with Secretary Clinton, and who are also at Treasury with Secretary Geithner and other places, so I'm able to kind of keep a conversation going with them. But I would break, when we think about prospects, think about two categories. The first is tailwinds or continued momentum, or tailwinds are like 顺风, that are helping push the relationship forward, and then some headwinds or 定风 that are countervailing forces. On the tailwind side, as I've already mentioned, there is the idea of this fundamental continuity of political will between Beijing and Washington to maintain a strong, high-level conversation around the issues that matter most to both of our countries, and that's a very good thing. Another tailwind is we like the phrase that we established habits of cooperation between our two governments at the central and federal government level. Habits of cooperation where we learned how to work together much better across all of the interagency. We learned how to work together much better even within our own government, because we all tend to be stovepiped. We saw our Chinese colleagues from the different ministries working better together. But new habits of cooperation, there are enough senior staff on the U.S. side and the Chinese government. You had your big change last year with the National People's Congress a year ago, so your team continues to be in place. And these new habits of cooperation and trust and understanding is an important momentum that we believe is going to continue and carry over. The other tailwind is it's become very clear, particularly with the economic crisis, that coordination in information sharing is really critical to be able to do that in a timely way. Last fall, particularly as the economic situation really kind of started to emerge, the ability, because of the relationships, because of these habits of cooperation, the phone calls, the ability by even cabinet secretaries and ministers and senior officials to be on the phone constantly between the U.S. and China, particularly the U.S. side explaining what we were doing in terms of these policies. So it wasn't just our Chinese colleagues reading in the newspaper, but us able to explain in real time what we were doing or attempting to do. And I think one could argue that the situation would be much, much worse if there wasn't able to be that type of information sharing. And certainly as the crisis continues, this realization that we are definitely in the same boat together, and the ability to share information, even in this new administration on the U.S. side, on our stimulus package, and to compare notes with for example, China's stimulus package, is very, very important and positive. And that will continue, I think, in a very robust way. On the headwind side, or the challenging side, the reality is we are in a very, very new time and place, and not just on our economy, but how all of the economic downturn is affecting anything from employment and what that means, to investment patterns, to psychological, to stresses in our communities, to international organizations, international financial institutions, the way finance happens. I mean, we're very much when we come out of this, we'll be in a very, very different place. And that's both an opportunity, but it's also very much of a challenge. How do we figure that out? How do we move into that new reality? And I see that as if not handled correctly, it could be very, very difficult. And a lot of that, again, will come down to ability to understand each other and understand the other's perspective. Another headwind, which is more pronounced in a time of economic stress, is protectionism in both of our countries. We have at this conference people who are all about remaining open to investment and globalization. And we've heard colleagues even just on the panel that say, come, we're open for business. That is the overwhelming, the majority view. But in both of our countries, there are very, very strong voices of protectionism regarding investment and certain types of ideology, and then certain parts, at least on the U.S. side in Congress as an example. And that will be difficult. to continue to handle. And that's why it's going to be very important for leadership at all levels, both at the central government level, but also in local levels, to be even more effective in articulating the benefits of trade and why we need to stay open to globalization, why we need to stay open to investment. We know, both from U.S. and Chinese history, that we've always done better when we've been open to the world than when we've been closed. So that's a headwind, and it's a challenge that we really need to step up to the plate on. Another challenge, and this is an ongoing challenge for any kind of government initiative, at least any government initiative I've been involved with, and that is at the national level, when we create these kind of mechanisms and dialogues, how do we create entry points for all sectors of society so that industry, so that the academic and scholarly world can be providing insights and information and views into our government mechanisms. That is particularly true at the national level, but for those of you who represent local governments in the U.S. and China, I'd really encourage you to consider how in your realities to involve your local academic institutions, your local businesses in partnership. We've heard the term today, a public-private partnership, which is a new concept, particularly in China. But it's more of a dynamic that I think would all benefit from really pushing into and developing more, involving all sectors of society. But that's the momentum of that in the relationship between our two countries, particularly at the government level, is not nearly strong enough, but we really have to continue that. And as much as we talk about trust and understanding, the reality is it's a chronic issue in our relationship. It's the human condition not to trust and to lack an understanding. We have increasingly an abundance of information about each other, but I would say we continue to have a deficit in understanding. And we need to really kind of close the gap between information, the facts or the data that's available, and really understand one another much better. I mean, the fact that you're here means you're working on this, but we really need to be a voice for that and continue to promote that in our communities and wherever we are. I definitely see that among the young people, which makes me feel like I'm getting older to say something like that. But the younger people in China and the graduate students I know in the U.S., again, a kind of information abundant, where the information age, where we can get online and we can Google a local county government and somewhere in China and look at their budgets, and we have all the information. But do we really understand? And that's really going to be very, very critical as we get the economic relationship between our two countries right in this century. But on that, again, I just really want to congratulate those of you on both U.S. and China's side for what you're doing there. I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks this 30 years since normalization. Sometimes I think of this phrase, a new normalization, and I don't mean that in a political sense of the word. The U.S.-China relationship is very solidly normalized on the political side, but what would it be like for us in the next 10, 20, 30 years to see a new normalization where this type of meeting is happening all across the United States and all across China, and our relationship is becoming much normal, where we understand each other much better. I see that trend happening, but it's not happening quickly enough or broadly enough, and we continue to have that as a challenge. But I think it's a great vision to put out there. What are we going to be in the decades to come in our lifetime and the life of our children? And our level of economic, our interdependence is demanding that from us. So I'll look forward to getting to know you all better this evening and tomorrow in Bloomington. And again, I appreciate Dr. Kennedy's invitation to be with you tonight. Thanks very much.